Chris. So welcome back, everyone. Thanks for coming back. We are the graveyard shift, but it's really good that lots of people have come back this afternoon. So this session is about speciesism and animals as commodities. And we have three great speakers this afternoon. So we have Sarah Gradidge from Anglia Ruskin University. Good job I checked that with her because I would have said that wrong, from Cambridge in the UK. Then we have Evelien Deelen from Washington State University in the US. And then we also have Corrina Lewis from the University of Liverpool in the UK. So my name's Kerry and I'm one of the PhD students at the University of Exeter within the EASE team. So I just thought I would just say something very quickly about this topic because I'm sure lots of you are familiar with these terms, but it's always good just not to assume knowledge. So speciesism, for anyone who hasn't come across that yet, it is a term that's broadly an animal rights term. And it was coined by Richard Ryder in the 1970s, but I guess made popular by Peter Singer and his book, Animal Liberation. And broadly what speciesism is really about the human propensity to actually see animals as different and therefore to treat them differently, and has resulted in what Singer and Ryder would talk about as lots of exploitation of other animals. So that's really what speciesism and where it comes from, but you can do lots more reading about that if you haven't come across that term. And then animals as commodities, so commodification of animals. What we're talking about there again is the propensity of for humans to use other animals, either their whole animal or their parts or products, as tools, instruments, or other abstract things. So that's what we're really talking about in these two definitions. So looking forward to our presentations, and over to Sarah to start.
Hi everybody, hopefully you can hear me. My video is off as we're having some technical difficulties, but hopefully you can hear me and that it will work fine. So I'll just share my screen. And let me know if you can't see it at all. There you go. Can you see this screen?
Can't see anything yet, Sarah.
Should try again. Stop sharing. Okay, I'll try again.
Oh yeah, can see you now.
I think it might just be very laggy, so we'll see if it works this time. Can you see the slides?
Yeah, I can see the slides.
Brilliant. Okay, hopefully this will be fine. And you can see the full screen there, yeah?
Yeah, we can now.
Brilliant. Okay. So yes, so my name is Sarah Gradidge. I'm from Anglia Ruskin University. I'm actually doing a PhD in psychology, and I'm actually coming up to my third year of my PhD now. And my PhD topic explores something called pet speciesism. This is a very specific type of speciesism. And it's essentially this idea that we view animals such as pets quite positively. So, for example, animals like dogs, we view them very positively, whereas animals like pigs, which aren't pets, we tend to view much more negatively. So it's this idea that we really have this prejudice against animals that aren't pets, animals that we might eat. We tend to view them very negatively, whereas animals that we share our homes with, obviously, we view very positively. And previous research does indicate that this pet speciesism exists. So, for example, in my master's research, I found that people, looked or perceived dogs as being more positive on a range of different measures. So, on about 5 different dependent variables, dogs are viewed as more positively. So, for example, people had more empathy for dogs than they did for pigs, and they were also more willing to help dogs as well. And pet speciesism has implications for how we treat animals. There's implications for our behaviour, and obviously, of course, by extension, it also has implications for animal welfare as well. So because we tend to view pigs more negatively, for example, it might be that we also treat them more negatively, and we might perhaps not have as positive behaviour intentions towards pigs as we do towards dogs. So obviously, as I found in my master's research, for example, people are less willing to help pig victims, and they're much more willing to help dog victims, for example. So there's a lot of implications here in terms of how we treat them and in terms of pig welfare. And of course, there's also implications in terms of meat consumption as well. So obviously in the West, we tend to consume a lot of pigs. There is a lot of pig product consumption. And of course, there's obvious implications for pig welfare. There's also implications in terms of the environment. So for example, we need to reduce our pig product consumption by about 8 times by 2050 to avoid negative increases in global world temperature. So it's a really, really important issue. It's a really global issue as well that we need to be able to solve. And so theoretically, if we can try to increase perceptions of pigs, if we can get people to view pigs more positively, we can also get them to treat pigs more positively and to eat less meat. And so that's where my research comes in, is I want to try to understand exactly why pet species exist. I want to understand what the causes are, why we view dogs positively and yet we view pigs in comparison quite negatively. And ultimately, I want to try to use these causes to inform interventions to try to overcome pet speciesism, to try to reduce it. And so my research basically draws on 2 literature bases. So it draws on, firstly, kind of general social psychological literature regarding perceptions of humans. And what I do is I try to apply these theories on perceptions of humans to perceptions of animals. So, for example, I draw on a model very heavily called the stereotype content model, which suggests that our perceptions of others splits into 2 dimensions called warmth and competence. Now, warmth basically refers to how positively or negatively we view another being's intent as. So we might view somebody else as having good intent or bad intent, for example. Whereas competence refers to how well we believe that being can enact that intent. So whether we believe that they are capable of actually acting on their intentions. And bias map is very similar to the SEM. It's actually an extension of the stereotype content model. And it suggests that these warmth and competence perceptions inform our behavioural intentions towards others. So if we view somebody as warm, we are more likely to want to actively help them and less to actively harm them. And if we view somebody else as being competent, we are more likely to want to passively help them and less likely to want to passively harm them. So there's a lot of implications here in terms of behaviour. So it's a really, really good framework to use to try to understand behaviour. And then the other literature base I also draw from is the general speciesism literature, so actually looking at perceptions of animals specifically. And this is much more sparse. There's not been much research on this at all, unfortunately, in terms of psychology. And there's a lot less literature here as compared to perceptions of humans. However, together these literature bases helped to inform my PhD. So in my first stage of my PhD, I wanted to look at predictors of pet specimens. I wanted to look at variables that could predict why we view dogs positively and why we view pigs negatively. So this was a non-causal, and what I did is I ran one study. So I ran a multivariate multiple regression. And in this multiple regression, I had 8 possible predictors. And what these were firstly familiarity and similarity. So firstly, I predicted that potentially a reason that we have this pet speciesism is because we're very familiar with dogs. Obviously, we tend to share our homes with dogs, our families. Whereas obviously with pigs, it's very, very rare for people to actually have pigs in their homes or to even really interact with pigs on a regular basis. And also, by extension, it might also be that we view dogs as more similar to us than pigs, because we share our homes with dogs, because they're part of our so-called in-group, potentially, we might view them as very similar to humans. Whereas pigs we might view as part of our outgroup, we might view them as being dissimilar to humans. Other predictors also included self-relevance. This refers to how often or how much we might use pigs or animals in general for our own benefit. So, for example, how much we might consume meat. And this actually splits into 2 different types. So it splits into one type, which is called objective self-relevance, which refers to how often we consume meat. So, for example, per week or per month. And then there's also subjective self-relevance, which refers to how much we enjoy consuming this meat. So these, they might go hand in hand. It might be that somebody who eats a lot of meat also enjoys eating a lot, but they can also be separate. So, for example, somebody might really enjoy eating meat. They might have high subjective self-relevance, but they might not eat it very often for health reasons, for example. So they can be separate as well. Other potential predictors also included pet status and profit status. So it might be that simply because dogs are labelled as being pets, that's why we view them more negatively. Just the pet label could be enough to increase people's perceptions of dogs. And because pigs are labelled as profit animals, they're labelled as animals that we use for meat, it might be that simply that label of being a profit animal also decreases perceptions of pigs. I also included 2 individual differences variables. These were empathy and also support for animal utility. Now, empathy, I believed, would be predictor decreased pet speciesism, whereas support for animal utility I predicted would have a predictive increased effect on pet speciesism. So I believe that the more people believe that we can use animals for our own benefits, that they would show more pet speciesism, for example.
Sarah, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Just some people are having a few issues hearing you. I'm just wondering if you can maybe come closer to your computer or maybe volume up. I know that you're having a few tech issues.
I know. I'm sorry, it's been tech issues, unfortunately. Can you hear me a bit better? I'm a bit closer now.
Yeah, if you could just get a bit closer. I know it's a bit difficult sometimes when we've all got different.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Hopefully you can hear me a bit better now. It's a bit closer.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, do carry on.
No worries. Yeah, so in this multiple regressions, I had these 8 predictive variables, and I was looking at their predictive effect on these 4 outcome variables. So the outcome variables were perceived warmth and perceived competence of dogs and pigs. And what I found in this regression is that 5 out of 8 were significant. So I found that in relation to self-relevance, for example, in line with my predictions for subjective self-relevance, there was a lower warmth for pigs when subjective self-relevance was greater. So for example, when people really enjoyed consuming pig meat, they viewed pigs as less warm. And this makes sense in relation to psychological literature. So for example, people tend to want to view animals that they eat quite negatively because it makes them feel better. It's something called motivated cognition. They want to feel, they want to try to view these animals negatively so that it kind of, I suppose, legitimizes their meat consumption, and it makes them feel better, and it increases their positive self-perception. Whereas objective self-relevance actually had the opposite effect, so it was in the opposite direction. And I did not predict this direction. So I predicted, just like subjective self-relevance, that objective self-relevance would, the more often people consume pig meat, the less warm they would perceive pigs to be. But actually, I found the opposite, which is quite interesting, that the more often people ate pigs, the warmer they perceive pigs to be, which was definitely not expected based on previous literature. Now, in relation to pet status, I found that the greater or the more an animal was viewed as being a pet, the warmer and more competent they were perceived to be. And also there was a generalizability effect. So the more that dogs were perceived to be as a pet, for example, the warmer and more competent pigs were also perceived to be, and vice versa. So there seems there was a generalizability across the 2 different animals as well. In relation to familiarity, I found that there were differential effects on warmth and competence depending on what species we were talking about. So for example, with dogs, the more familiar dogs perceived to be, the warmer they were perceived as, whereas the more familiar pigs were perceived as being, the more competent they were perceived as. So there was a differential effect on warmth and competence depending on the species. And then finally, for similarity, I found that the more similar either dogs or pigs were perceived as being, the warmer and more competent they were perceived as. Unlike pet status, there was no generalizability effect here. So if dogs were perceived as being more similar to humans, this effect did not translate across to pigs, for example. Now, this is very interesting to find these predictive effects, but of course, this is not causal. So what I wanted to do in the next stage of my PhD is to assess these 5 variables in a causal sense. So the second stage was looking at these causes in 3 separate studies. So in the first study, I wanted to test these effects of self-relevance. So testing objective and subjective self-relevance. So what I did is I got this very cute animal, this tree kangaroo, and I got participants to answer or to read an imaginary text. So they were reading an imagined scenario, this text that I'd created. This text basically asked participants to imagine that they had been offered to consume tree kangaroo meat. So somebody has approached them and they said that you can consume some meat from this animal here. And the things that were manipulated were objective self-relevance. So participants asked to imagine that they either said, yes, I will eat some of this meat. So that would be objective self-relevance, or to imagine they refused. So that would be no objective self-relevance. And they were also asked to imagine either they had eaten tree kangaroo meat in the past and they really enjoyed it. So that was subjective self-relevance, or they'd eaten tree kangaroo meat in the past and they really didn't enjoy it. So there was no subjective relevance. And I also included time here as well, just to test pre versus post manipulation, just to check that any effects of my manipulation were genuine and not just due to effects, kind of natural effects between or differences between the group. And so what I found, so there were actually no main effects on warmth. And this is what kind of wasn't expected. Obviously, based on the regression, I was expecting there would be effects on warmth. Instead, what I found was this very complicated regression interaction here, where I found when there was no subjective self-relevance, there was significant interaction between objective self-relevance and time. And so basically what this means is that when participants were asked to imagine they did not enjoy consuming this meat, there was an interaction between objective self-relevance and time, such that at time 2, after manipulation, when participants were asked to imagine that they did not consume the meat, they viewed the animal as being warmer. Whereas when they're asked to imagine they did consume the tree kangaroo's meat, they viewed the animal as less warm. So it suggests this complex interaction here, and perhaps more complex than the regression had originally hinted at. So that was slightly more complicated than I had expected here. In regards to competence, obviously based on the regression, I hadn't predicted any effects on competence, as we didn't find anything in the regression to do with that. And indeed, that's what I found here, so there are no effects on competence. In regards to behavioural intentions, obviously active help and active harm, thinking about the bias map, for example, we know that warmth predicts increased active help and decreased active harm. So based on the bias map, I was predicting effects on these two variables. And actually what I found is there were no effects. So even though there was a significant interaction between objective and subjective self-relevance on active harm, this was not, it didn't interact with time as well. So it suggests that these groups are just naturally differing even from the start. And in regards to active help, there were no significant effects at all. In regards to passive help and harm, again, I've predicted no effects based on the competence findings from the regression. Obviously, there were no effects on competence, so I predicted no effects on passive help and passive harm. And indeed, that's what I found here as well. So overall, there weren't very many effects apart from this complicated interaction effect on warmth. So I actually did a follow-up study to see, to try to find out why perhaps this was, why there was a lack of effects. And what I found actually is that people were very, very resistant to thinking about consuming an animal. So what I actually found is that when I included these texts again in a follow-up study, that it didn't increase people's willingness to eat the tree kangaroo, for example, and how much they believed they would enjoy eating the tree kangaroo meat also didn't change. So essentially, it seems that the texts weren't manipulating exactly what I wanted them to manipulate. And actually, this indicates potentially that people are quite resistant to thinking about consuming novel animals. They're quite resistant to the idea of eating new animals. This could perhaps be linked to something called food neophobia, which is where people are very scared to try out new foods, or they can be, especially foods like meat. So people can be quite resistant to trying out new kinds of meat. And so I suppose this begs the question as to why, if we're so resistant to eating meat from unknown animals, how can we eat meat from so many domestic animals like pigs and cows, for example? So my second study is Familiarity and Similarity, and actually I won't be going into detail on this one today, but I have just finished data analysis this week. So very similar to self-relevant study, again, participants were asked to read text about a tree kangaroo, and this was manipulated on whether the animal was familiar. So participants were asked to imagine whether they could interact with a tree kangaroo or not, and also similarity, so whether the tree kangaroo was described as being similar or dissimilar to humans. And interestingly, similarity did have effects on warmth, competence, and active help and passive help as well, such that when the tree kangaroo was described as being similar, people viewed the tree kangaroo as being more warm, more competent, and they're also more willing to actively and passively help the animal. There were no effects on harm. Familiarity was a bit different, so there weren't any effects there, so I found no effects, which is quite interesting because previous research suggests that imagining contact with animals is an effective way of improving perceptions of them, but I did not find that in this study. And then finally, in my stage 2, I'll also be looking at the causal effect of pet status. So again, with the tree kangaroo text, manipulating whether the tree kangaroo is described as being a pet or not. And finally, ultimately, I'll be going into stage 3, which is thinking about how can pet speciesism be reduced. So using these 3 studies, these causes, how can I create an intervention that might actually work to improve behaviour towards pigs? And this will form two intervention experiments where I'll be looking at firstly behavioural intentions, and then hopefully in the second behaviour looking at actual behaviour as much as it's possible. So looking at whether people actually reduce their meat consumption, for example. And that is my presentation for today, and I hope you could hear me. I hope it was getting through, and we can now go to questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Turning my mic back on. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you. There's been some interesting comments in the chat, but I think what we'll do is we'll go straight into the second presentation, and we'll take questions from all the presentations at the end, if that's okay, because that seems to work better in these sessions. So if that's okay with you, so we'll go next to Evelien, Deelen, and we'll take questions from all three presenters at the end of the session.
Right, let me go and try share my screen. Right, you will see this?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, cool. So before I introduce myself, I would like to share two snippets of ethnographic view, two quotes accompanied by a photograph. In the holding chute, handlers may incite the bucking horse by shocking her, pulling her mane or tail, or slapping her face. The bucking strap and spurs cause a great pain and sometimes produce bloody wounds on the flank area. She will buck uncontrollably as a result, sometimes slamming into fences, posts, or chute. Eventually, she will trip and fall. Do our horses like to buck? Yes, of course, otherwise they wouldn't. These horses have a genetic predisposition to buck, which we further cultivate and reinforce. An abused animal cannot and will not perform to the top of their ability. We want our buckers to love it. So my name is Evelien, and I'm a PhD student in cultural anthropology at Washington State University, although I am originally from the Netherlands. And today I'm going to talk about an article that I wrote called The Good Animal, which contains the result of a study of Etic attitudes towards the use of animals in rodeo. And this is just the outline of my study. I'm going to introduce the study to you first. Then I'm going over the background of rodeo and animal welfare real quick. I'm going to explain my materials and methods, the results of my study, the discussion and conclusion, and then questions or move on to the next presentation. So the impetus for this article was drawn from ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted over the course of the last 2 years amongst rodeo associates, so people involved in rodeo such as participants, organizers, and fans from the Western United States. And this fieldwork was part of an anthropological study, so my graduate research on human-horse relations in rodeo. And during interviews, my informants would consistently revert to the topic of rodeo criticisms and the ways in which they had been personally scrutinized by and attacked by animal activists. And although their hearts are in the right place, my informants always state about rodeo activists, their actions are problematic because they keep misinformation about the sport in place. And my informants argued that anti-rodeo sentiments often rely on outdated, stereotypical assumptions concerning the involvement of animals in the sport, while disregarding more accurate emic explanations. And this had resulted in widespread folk myths about the use and welfare of rodeo animals, the most common of which many people have heard of, which concerns the provocation of bulls and horses by tightening ropes around their external reproductive organs. And the different perspectives about the role of animals in this sport have been mentioned by rodeo historians and anthropologists, such as myself. But so far, none of these works have included a detailed analysis of the underlying beliefs of rodeo opponents. And studies of animal welfare and ethics neither offer much further insight on the subject, because they discuss what people find problematic, but not why they think so. Discussions about rodeo often center on topics such as ethics and animal rights, but I wanted to take a closer look at these perspectives to really understand the reasoning of rodeo opponents at a deeper level. And as I was becoming more involved in my graduate research in general, it became apparent to me that animal activists are important actors in the social environment of rodeo. And in order to gain a holistic understanding of this environment, the views of rodeo opponents needed to be included in my inquiry. So contemporary American rodeo is a national sport and a multi-million-dollar industry, but also has been a Western folk tradition and social event for over a century. Its origins lie in the cattle ranching practices that dominated the settled cultural landscape and environment of the Western United States for centuries. And the different categories that make up the events in rodeo are standardized, ritualized versions of cattle ranching practices, and they reflect the different skills that the mounted cattle herders have to master. And rodeo is in essence a multi-species effort, as it relies equally on the participation of humans and animals. Bulls and horses are required for the so-called rough-stock events, in which a cowboy has to ride a bucking horse or bull for 8 seconds. Steers and calves are required for the roping events, in which a mounted cowboy has to try and catch a free-running bovine as quickly as possible. And in addition, highly trained saddle horses are required for these roping events, but also for races, for ceremonies, and for guarding the livestock out of the arena. So there are various forms of collaboration with animals who are all made to play a specific role. However, ever since rodeo became a formalized event, there have been people who have voiced their displeasure with the way in which animals were treated. And animal activists can be found protesting at rodeos, but they also have a very strong online presence where they aim to educate the public and collect funding for their work. And although in extreme cases, protesters may try to harm rodeo associates or even their animals, in general, it seems that through raising support and gaining awareness, these groups try to influence laws and policymakers into implementing changes. So in order to better understand this social phenomena of, opposing to rodeo's practices, I studied the online content of 9 activist groups who oppose the rodeo and who expressed their sentiments on publicly accessible websites. And the first step of the data collection process consisted of using Google to identify and select websites to build my sample. And I tried to emulate the search that a regular member of the public might conduct by using terms such as rodeo and abuse, rodeo and cruel, etc. And when I conducted my data collection in the fall of 2019, this resulted in the identification of 9 websites which contained 10 unique articles. And the analysis of the data relied on a grounded theory approach, which is a method that relies on inductive reasoning. You go in with a research question, not a hypothesis. And it relies on a systematic bottom-up analysis of the ethnographic text, the purpose of which is letting the data speak for itself and letting certain results and category of information emerge from the text through which you construct explanations for the social phenomena and theories and all that. So these are the codes that I label to my text. Coding is the first step of a grounded theory analysis. So quite similar in the ways in which we analyze ethnographic interviews. And I just wanted to show these to you to kind of give you an idea of the sentiments that are expressed on these websites. And I'm sure you can get a pretty clear picture, based on these codes. And I'm sure they're vernacular that many of you who are involved with like animal welfare and ethics studies are familiar with. So the analysis of my codes, and especially of the categories that these codes formed, and the relationships amongst these categories, indicated to me that animal activists present their arguments through the creation of various narratives regarding what they see as the true nature of animals, of humans, and of the sport and industry of rodeo. So if you look at the first one, activists view rodeo animals as forced participants and forced performers. And in their eyes, these creatures are made to be present at these loud, crowded, and stressful events, and they silently have to undergo whatever people desire. But their mere presence, it's not enough, as the animals are also made into active actors who are forced to conform to these anthropocentric expectations and social constructs. Like they have to actively participate in these events. And in this process, rodeo associates are believed to use harmful tools and devices to force the animals to act in that desired way. And unlike human athletes, rodeo animals have no choice and no agency over their fate. And if you look at the second narrative, this refers to the natural state of being, the good animal here, the natural state of being and behavior of animals, which is contrasted by the artificial behavior they demonstrate at these rodeo events. And the animals are generally believed to be relatively tame and peaceful creatures, like even the wild horses and bulls. And these animals do not want to behave in this way on their own accord, but they are provoked by external stimuli into this like altered state of being. And in regard to horses bucking, for example, one website stated that bucking is in fact not a natural activity for a horse, and that horses don't normally jump up and down, but that certain devices cause the animal to behave violently or display these abnormally dramatic reactions. And the third narrative, which I named the human facade, refers to the facade of rodeo as a facade of like sport, entertainment, and tradition behind which people hide. And central to the argument is the lack of a practical necessity to subject rodeo animals to these practices. And because rodeo is not a necessary activity for animal husbandry, it doesn't reflect, ranching practices of the American West. Humans engage in these activities because of apathy, greed, and a desire to be something they are not, which is true cowboys. And in the eyes of the animal activist groups, rodeo participants misuse rodeo to relieve this romanticized idea of the Wild West, of playing a cowboy in the Wild West at the expense of animals. Okay. So how can all this information explain why animal activists are so strongly opposed to rodeo? And the way I see it is that these groups have a certain perspective on animal selfhood and experience that duels with the practices and perspective on which rodeo is based. They are trying to argue for the perspective of the animal, although often without true measurement, but kind of based on their folk understanding of what animals are truly like, what they experience, and what they think is best for them. And this debate cannot be condensed to opposing perspective on animal rights, for example, or the ethical ramifications of rodeo, because it is a lot more complex than that. It goes a lot deeper than just a debate about animal rights or morality or ethics. And studies like this have to take into consideration that we are working with two populations who think they have a better understanding of the true nature of animals and correct ways of dealing with them. So reflecting on the study, I think that its limitations mainly revolve around the limited sample. When I went into the data collection process, I originally planned to look at about 40 websites to create this really broad sample. But even after an extensive search with multiple search queries, I could only find these 9 websites that contained 10 unique articles in total. So this relatively small sample might impact the reliability of the data if more websites exist that I just couldn't find, or if advocacy groups are also present on other media platforms that were not part of the sample of the study. So I think that future studies should take into consideration that more additional methods should be employed to create a larger sample to make sure that the information that we find is representative for the perspectives of these animal rights groups. And this could include, for example, also ethnographic interviews or a broader analysis of social media. But this specific study is a part of my my research into rodeo. It's not the main subject, and I just want to make sure that I achieve that holistic view of perspectives towards rodeo animals. So I was aware of all the different actors in that socially mediated environment. So yeah, that's it. I don't know if there's any questions or if you want to leave that to the end of this session.
Thank you, Evelien. Yeah, what we'll do is we will come back to questions and discussion points and comments at the end, if that's okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. So just in the interest of time now, we'll move on to the final presentation, and then we'll come back to discussions and questions from all three, if that's okay with everyone. So just introducing Corrina Lewis now. So if you want to upload your presentation, Corrina, thank you.
Can everybody see that okay?
Sure can.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Corrina. I'm currently in my second year of a PhD at the University of Liverpool. My PhD is actually unrelated to this. I'm a law student exploring asymmetric personhood for animals. But this is kind of my passion, really, as I have 2 of my 4 dogs are actually from hoarding situations. Specifically, one of them, Lucy, came from a situation I talk about a little bit, where she was one of 58 chihuahuas kept in a single room. She'd never been outside. She was nearly 9 when we got her from the rescue. She'd never been outside. She had a whole slew of physical ailments and behavioural issues. And unfortunately, the person who did this, that nothing really happened of it because the rescue had to sort of bargain to get the few ones that really needed veterinary care and agree to sort of leave the rest behind, really. So basically, my whole thing is really, despite the provable cruelty, they were obviously neglected. Nothing really happened. There was no other intervention. And for all I know, the person who did this to Lucy and my other dog from a hoarding situation, Merlin, they could well have accumulated the exact same amount of number of dogs again. So it's something that's very close to my heart, really. Yeah, so what is animal hoarding? Well, first described in a study conducted in 1981 as the ownership of large numbers of animals. Animal hoarding has since been characterized by the Hoarding of Animals Research Consortium as a condition that often includes self-neglect, neglect of dependent family members if that is applicable, and an extreme lack of sanitation. Labeled as a disorder, Hoarding, whether it's inanimate objects or living animals, has had a range of psychological theories applied to it, with comparisons drawn between compulsive collecting and obsessive compulsive disorder. Often labelled as addicts and stress offenders, but without the active harm often associated with these types of offenders, and sometimes considered childhood attachment gone awry. There does not appear to be any sort of one-size-fits-all explanation for the phenomenon, leaving it as a largely unanswered question, certainly over here in the UK, and it's reflected in society and the laws that we don't have essentially for them. So it's traditionally not considered a crime in the strictest sense of the word. It's more frequently cited as an animal control problem. Animal hoarding has only in recent years become an acknowledged issue, certainly in the US, thanks in large part to an increased understanding and consideration of human mental health issues. But this does unfortunately mean that the victimization of the animals involved often takes a back seat to the human issues, which is reflected in the reluctance to prosecute. So compared to outright cruelty, so, physically and deliberately abusing an animal, the harm inflicted in animal hoarding cases is actually, I think anyway, often more insidious, just because of the neglect involved. This kind of passive mistreatment is sometimes accidental, sometimes deliberate, but nearly always ingrained in a maladaptive or warped human companion animal bond, which is the term used to define the interspecies relationship. So for instance, in one case in the US, a hoarder couple named the Ericsons struggled to cope after they amassed 552 dogs. The dogs resorted to cannibalism in order to survive, with weaker animals such as whelping mothers and their pups being targeted. Several dogs were found half-eaten by rescuers. Yet Barbara Erickson believed herself to be a saviour of the animals, on a mission of mercy to save them. She argued that any quality of life was better than no quality at all. And this mindset is mirrored quite often in other accounts of animal hoarders, with a study conducted by, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, but Vaca Guzman and Arluk into the justifications made by hoarders in order to normalise their behaviour. The largest percent, which was about just shy of 69% of justifications found in press articles, centred on the self-perception of being animal rescuers, despite the actual suffering that they ended up causing the animals. So compared to other forms of harm, I mean, whether it's accidental or not, as far as I'm concerned, I'm sure a lot of you will agree, the outcome is the same. The animals are still suffering. Whilst hoarding takes place over a longer period of time than singular instances of active cruelty, it's much less likely to be discovered and reported, as many hoarders have insular and avoidant personalities. Suffering may continue for weeks, months, or possibly even years before help arrives the animals, if it even ever does help arrive at all. So as far as I'm concerned, lack of intention on the part of the hoarder doesn't really negate the abuse. So the effects on the animals, in the UK, most caregivers of animals are largely uninformed about their companion animals' needs, with 87% unaware of the full extent of the principal welfare requirements as set out in Section 9.2 of the Animal Welfare Act 2006. They're based on the 5 freedoms, literally the most basic things like food and water, the ability to express appropriate behaviour, that kind of thing. So yes, as I say, very basic things. Emotional needs are not properly covered by the Act either, and are even less likely to be considered. In hoarding situations where the animals have not ever been socialised or may never have encountered another human being even, as is often the case, knowledge and consideration of these basic needs is even less likely. So non-human animals that are victims of neglect experience both emotional and physiological issues. In a study conducted by Yoffe et al., all of the animals rescued from hoarding situations needed some form of veterinary intervention, with dead animals having to be removed from the premises in well over a third of all cases. So commonly encountered ailments include necrosis, respiratory illnesses, emaciation, anemia, dehydration, fleas, worms, mange, lots and lots of dental issues as well, particularly in small dogs. Lucy, for instance, and Merlin both have dental problems, and Lucy had an abscess on the side of her face, which was extremely painful for her. obviously. Alongside the quite often immediately physical issues, though, there are the under-considered psychological effects, with studies such as the one conducted by Yoffe et al. Noting behavioural problems in every single case. This is due to issues such as lack of socialisation, so for instance being kept in cages or never being allowed outside for walks, and intense overcrowding. Because of the sheer amount of animals in such small spaces, they become territorial in order to survive, fighting for water, resources, as well as defending themselves against challengers or other stronger dogs, or cats. Or it has been posited that non-human animal survivors of abuse manifest behaviours in common with human children survivors of abuse. These include, but are not limited to, excessive fear of strangers, anxiety and depression, aggression, and learned helplessness. There is no doubt that animals suffer acute trauma from their experiences in such conditions. Yeah, so the law in the UK, so England and Wales, I'm just using UK, but it is England and Wales specifically. The main statute for ensuring the welfare of domesticated non-human animals is the Animal Welfare Act 2006, the AWA. It replaced quite an archaic piece of legislation from 1911 called the Protection of Animals Act, and it centred around the act of cruelty itself. So it was kind of reactive rather than proactive, which is something they tried to rectify with the AWA. The AWA focuses on the unnecessary suffering of non-human animals and the responsibility of their human guardians, caregivers, owners, to curtail this suffering by fulfilling their legal obligation to ensure that the needs of any non-human animals in their care are met. Interestingly, the term welfare has been considered one that could be juxtaposed against child welfare. It has been suggested by, I think it was Noel Sweeney, who said that it's an interesting comparison to make. That the term welfare was initially used for children and has expanded it to animals. So theoretically, it's supposed to sort of invoke the similar feelings of care and welfare and warmth towards these creatures. But it obviously it has come out slightly different. So it's really in this sort of weird legal grey area that the phenomenon of animal hoarding finds itself. In theory, any non-human animal, as defined in Section 1 of the AWA, which is a vertebrate other than man, is protected from unnecessary suffering. In order to prevent unnecessary suffering, the burden is placed on the human in control of the animal. There does not need to be an intention to commit crime under the Act. So you could be reckless as to whether your animal suffers, or negligent as to whether they suffer. So a lack of intention then does not excuse an individual from prosecution. But under Section 4.3e, the person must be competent in a way that those suffering from a DSM recognised mental health illness, such as the compulsion to hoard animals or objects, may not be. So theoretically, under the AWA, if an individual is responsible for an animal, then they have a duty of care for that animal. In practice, however, any failure to provide such care does not always does not equate to a crime necessarily being committed. So although these laws are in place to guarantee the protection of non-human animals in our care, they are influenced by the object-subject bifurcation in law. As I'm sure we all know, objectification is the process by which an individual is denied certain characteristics that would otherwise validate them as subjects. And subjects in law are treated as having rights, whereas objects are not. In UK law, animals are objects unable to hold rights, and therefore they are essentially property to be owned, as inanimate objects are. So, for instance, at the moment, the theft of a beloved pet, often considered to be a member of the family and mourned as such, is currently only under the remit of the Theft Act 1968, which cites that any animal reduced into captivity or possession is only emotionally worth as much as, say, a car or a mobile phone. Despite calls for this change over the past couple of years, and a new offence to be created specifically to acknowledge both the sentience of companion animals and their emotional and familial importance, the government have so far refused to reclassify pet theft as a crime in its own right. I think it was in 2018, they basically shut it down straight away and said that the Theft Act was enough. I think they are sort of potentially going to review it in light of all the pets that have been bought and the pet theft that's on the rise in this country during COVID-19, but nothing's happened just yet. So essentially, as a living being with no comparable rights, non-human animals are therefore under the ownership and control of the hoarder. So akin to hostage negotiation, rescuers must bargain for the release of the animals from the hoarders, prioritizing those with the worst sort of physical ailments rather than forcibly removing them, as would happen in a human child neglect case. With children, intervention can be triggered at the first sign of neglect when the standard of care is indicated to be falling, but there's no such early warning system that exists for cases of animal abuse. The RSPCA receives approximately 1,000 reports of animal hoarding per year, yet it's only the most severe cases that result in prosecution. And even when this is successful, the sentencing is extremely weak compared to the extreme harm suffered. I believe at the moment it's still 6 months. I think there is a campaign that is, and there's actually a bill that's going through Parliament at the moment that hopefully will succeed, that puts it up to 5 years. But at the moment it's 6 months for any act of animal cruelty, no matter how horrific. So yeah, in the prosecution report for 2017, a woman was convicted of 5 counts of neglect under the Animal Welfare Act, Section 9. Despite all but one of the 10 cats involved having to be euthanized, she was ordered to pay costs of less than £2,000 and was disqualified for keeping animals for 10 years. That was it. As previously discussed, the psychological harm resulting from this form of abuse is comparable to the trauma that human children experience in similar situations. The welfare aspect of the law was likely included to equate the protection which should be afforded to both children and non-human animals, yet this type of established harm to animals is often ignored by the UK legal system, whether mental illness on the part of the abuser is a factor or not. In 2014, a woman was jailed for 2 years after her son was found in squalid conditions, surrounded by dogs and ferrets, despite the fact that the dead animals were also found on the premises and the whole family had been living in squalor. The woman was not convicted under the Animal Welfare Act. So what needs to change? So the RSPCA's current approach is one of mitigation. They're keen to work with the hoarder in order to remove the animals in need of immediate veterinary attention to alleviate the pressure, allowing the hoarder to retain control of the rest of the animals who may be suffering severe mental stress. This approach potentially appeases the hoarder and may work as a long-term solution to prevent further instances, though this is not always effective and it does not help the animals who have already been subjected to suffering, yet remain in the damaging situation due to not having any physical issues or having lesser physical issues than the ones that were removed. Preventative measures must therefore be considered rather than only after the fact mitigation. The RSPCA's limited powers of entry and their lack of impetus to take legal action result in hoarding often being a theoretical crime that is in practice not prosecuted. The lack of actual punishment reinforces the perception of these offences as minor crimes, and the current sentencing structure for animal cruelty under the AWA for the crimes that actually get to the courtroom, in my opinion, do not create a sufficient deterrent, which undermines the effort, the money and the time spent in prosecution, spent in prosecution in the first place. It's sort of a catch-22 of the legal system here in England and Wales. Hoarding is not taken seriously because prosecutions are rare. Prosecutions are rare because hoarding is not taken seriously. Not only this, but the repeat offender rates are astounding in cases not prosecuted. Some estimates have them as high as 100%. Some are a little bit more conservative, around 25%. Petronek's 1999 study found that repeat offenders accounted for nearly 2/3 of all hoarding cases. US studies have revealed that significant numbers of hoarders will simply start collecting again if their animals are removed, showing that without the provision of either punishment or mental health treatment, the cycle will continue. Other studies concur, whilst acknowledging that similar figures will most likely not include those who were never prosecuted in the first place or cases of repeat offences, making the actual numbers unknown. So regulation of the number of animals per square foot is one solution potentially seen in certain states in the US. I think there's Aurora in Illinois and Banks County in Georgia who've taken these kind of measures, but it does have a limited effectiveness as due to the catch-all nature of the legislation. It fails to take into account large numbers of animals in situations where the needs are being met. Alongside this, the actual monitoring and actioning of this would be difficult due to the RSPCA's already stretched resources. Yeah, so my solution, just something that I have been potentially looking into to sort of bring it out of the legal grey area and into the black. Whenever this type of animal cruelty is found, all the animals should be removed from the offender's possession, whether they're showing signs of whether they have physical ailments or not. They should all just straight away be taken. With this form of animal cruelty being considered a separate strict liability offence, which means that mens rea doesn't need to be proven, so it doesn't matter whether they are able to say that, no, I was mentally unwell, I couldn't, I didn't realise what I was doing was wrong, or I thought that I was doing the right thing. It's strict liability offences are essentially like a speeding fine. Doesn't matter why you did it, the fact that you did it. You know, it's also quite an effective, efficient way to get through the courts, really, I find. But yeah, it should also automatically result in the hoarder being banned from keeping animals for life, as well as mental health care offered. I don't believe that a custodial sentence would be useful in most situations, but there have been some quite high profile cases in the UK where hoarding has been kind of a vindictive. I think there was a case with a farm a few years ago where it was just essentially a breeding unit, and they were prosecuted under the AWA. But again, the punishment didn't really fit the crime there. Should have been a lot more for them. But yeah, so I believe that it will potentially improve prosecution rates and increase the deterrent, as well as preventing further offences and protecting animals already harmed. However, as I'm exploring my PhD, it's only a possible fix for the current legal system. I really believe that the most effective way to prevent these types of situations, and indeed all animal cruelty offences, would be if the legal status for non-human animals was changed from objects to subjects. And my final slide is just a picture of my two from the hoarding situations. The black and white one is Lucy, and the ginger one with the silly tongue is Merlin. They're both very happy now, but obviously day to day it's difficult for them. But yeah, so thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Corrina. Thank you. Okay, so some really interesting presentations this afternoon, and some quite difficult stuff, I think. So we'll have a look at some questions in a second, but I just wanted to make a polite reminder to people, really, and just, I guess this is maybe me and my own research, but I felt quite triggered by some of the images in the presentations this afternoon. So it's just a polite reminder, really, to people that if you're going to use images that are quite distressing, that it can be helpful just to let people know, just so that they're aware. But that could be my own compassion fatigue speaking, because my own research is quite tricky. But anyway, let's go to some questions. So can we start? I'm having to scroll back up. So if we start with some questions for Sarah, I think there were quite a few comments that I might have to distill. If anybody wants to kind of put their mic on and speak and ask questions, then please do that. But I'm just going to try and distill some of the comments and some of the thoughts, maybe. So distilling a couple of comments from a couple of different people around pigs and dogs, and people who keep companion pigs and dogs together. And some of the suggestions were that maybe in relation to familiarity, that that one of the reasons maybe that we feel less warmth towards animals that we don't know well is because we don't have the opportunity to know them. But for those people who live with pigs, when they introduce those pigs to other people, then the feedback is that their perceptions and their feelings towards those animals change. So I don't know whether you wanted to speak back to that, Sarah, or if anybody else wanted to come in.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and really great to hear of these anecdotes where it's worked. And yeah, definitely it's very, very, based in psychology. It definitely makes sense, because when people interact with outgroups, they tend to then perceive them more positively as a result of interacting with them. So it makes sense that these interactions with pigs or living with pigs helps people to make that connection, as it were, and to then view pigs more positively. Sometimes I think sometimes it doesn't seem to work with everyone. I think it was actually quite an interesting program on, I think it was Channel 4, something called Meet Your Meats, and people actually looked after, I think, pigs, cows, chickens, or not cows, but pigs and chickens, etc., for a few weeks, and then they had to decide at the end of the program whether they wanted to then eat that animal as meat, or whether to keep the animal as a pet. And some of them did definitely make that connection. For some people, they still didn't. So I think there is still this, I suppose, nuance between, for some reason it seems to work with some people, perhaps not with other people. So I think there's definitely a lot of scope there for research to find out why it works with some people, perhaps not others. Obviously, in my research, I'm looking more at imagined contact, mostly because it's a very easy thing to do. It can be a lot harder for people to actually interact with pigs, especially at the moment with COVID. So it could be a lot easier to ask them to imagine interacting with a pig. But obviously, in my research, in my second study in my stage 2, I found that imagined contact didn't seem to work, which is interesting there. And it actually disagrees with previous research. I think recently published research from last year, which suggests that interacting with a cow, for example, does help. So the research is kind of quite mixed at the moment. I think we definitely need more research in this area, both on imagined contact and actual contact with food, so-called food animals.
Thank you, Sarah. Any more thoughts or comments for Sarah? I'm struggling to keep up with the chat. Sorry, everyone. Maybe the easiest is just to switch your mic on and speak if there are any more thoughts and comments on that. Okay. Okay. So, so thoughts and comments and questions for Evelien. Okay. So I can see that Katie asked about the similarities between practices, between rodeo practices and bullfighting, and I can see you've answered that, Evelien. I'm just looking at others. Okay. Sorry, everyone. Okay. So Teresa's asking, how do you cope with witnessing such horrors of the rodeo?
I try to keep a very sort of like cultural relativist view whenever I'm at rodeos or whenever I see people interacting with their animals. I mean, rodeo is complex. Rodeo is not rodeo. There's multiple types of events, multiple different things that people do with animals. The bull riding and the horse riding, the bucking horse riding, I don't really see a problem with that. But for example, the calf and steer roping, I'm not really a fan of those events because I think they do more harm to the bodies of those animals than bull riding does, for example. But on the other hand, I've been a member of like various equestrian communities for long enough to realize that like everybody does different things to their animals and with their animals, and getting too invested in those things doesn't really do you any good. So I try to just keep my distance from the things that I don't like, and respect, the opinion of my informants, and then, think what I want to think in my own mind, but I often don't really share that with them because they are so scrutinized and so wary of outsiders. On the other hand, though, I think, most of us live in Western countries where a lot of animals live very good lives, very, I would almost say, pampered lives. But if you look at the reality of human-horse relations or human-animal relations at a broader level, like if you compare our situations with those in like, non-weird countries, there's a lot of situations in which animals are a lot worse off than they are at rodeo. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that in the grander scheme of things, on like a worldwide scale of human-animal relations, it doesn't make it right. Teresa says, yeah, but it's also reality. I mean, I'm trying to like formulate what I want to say. Like I feel like the views that we in the West have on animals are kind of, you know, coddled, and animals have a very special place in our lives. But that is not how, you know, the reality is. You can disagree with it or not. Like in the grander scheme of things, not all people have, you know, the luxury of dealing with animals the same way as I in the Netherlands or in the US have, for example. So that's why I was saying I try to keep like a sort of like a relativist mindset whenever I study rodeo, and I sort of like distance myself from the practices, because the things that I don't agree with, I'm not gonna change. So I just keep my distance from it, and you know.
Thank you. So yeah, I've got a couple of questions, but I'll go to Jess has got a question here. So what do you hope will come from your research into rodeo? And my question relates to that, so if I can ask it as well.
Yeah, of course.
What what motivated your research? Why are you interested in looking at the cultural environment of rodeo?
I think it is a lot different than sort of like the cultural environment of equestrianism in the Netherlands, for example. Like in rodeo, a lot of animals, like the bulls and the bucking horses, they're being bred for what rodeo people call like an innate or a genetic bucking trait. So the whole purpose of these animals is so different than the purpose of horses in other environments. And I think that is so interesting that people breed these animals based on like this type of behavior that we don't want to see, whereas in rodeo they do want to see that. In terms of that is just why I personally think it's so interesting. And then in terms of the implications of my research, I feel that there is a need to kind of bridge the gap between the two perspectives, between the perspectives of the opponents and the perspectives of the proponents. Because right now, like a lot of things in the United States, the views are very polarized. You're either super for rodeo, like, you know, the Western, many of the Western rural people are, or you're super against it. And the debate is super polarized as well, but there's no middle ground. People don't really respect each other's perspectives. So what I hope with my research is kind of create that middle ground and demonstrate to policymakers, for example, how they can be more culturally sensitive and create better results with their policies. And like, if you want to change rodeo related policies and propose that to a lot of rodeo people, you know, they're not going to be receptive for it, because in their mind you're like attacking their tradition and you're trying to take away the, you know, the freedom that they have to do with animals whatever they feel is right. So if you're too abrupt, you're not going to be able to get them receptive for your changes. But if you're a little bit more culturally sensitive, then I think implementing change in the long run is going to be a lot more effective. So that is what I hope to achieve with my study, to demonstrate that there can be a middle ground between proponents and opponents. And yeah, I guess that.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just interject very, very quickly? I'm just very conscious of time. And yeah, I just want to make sure that every presenter gets a chance to answer some questions.
Yeah, I'm just moving. Okay, so thanks so much. And questions for Corrina. Okay, apologies everyone, this is quite a lot. Okay, Corrina, do you want to pull out, while I'm searching, do you want to pull out a question that you can see in the chat? Would that be okay, that you can see quickly, that you can answer? Oh, hang on. Okay, so the first one I can see here is from Luca, about estimates of the number of neglected animals through hoarding for the UK. So are you aware of any figures relating to numbers in the UK or Europe?
In the UK, the only numbers we have are that come from the RSPCA, And again, they are complete estimates because obviously, although over here I would argue that hoarding is probably a little bit more detectable simply because of the way we're a little bit more packed in our country. So it's a little bit harder to hide 50 dogs in one house than it is in the US, where you're a bit more spread out. But even still, it's literally just in the RSPCA welfare report that comes out at the end of every year. And as I say, it's just estimates, and they get reports of around 100,000. And I think it's something like I think it's less than 5% of those reach court, and that's for all cases. So yeah, it's not really looked at much in this country, to be honest.
I've got a quick question, just okay. Yeah. So I was just wondering, there's a debate that I do sometimes with my students, and I really liked the lens that you were applying to your research, looking at it through the perspective of law and, what could we change with regards to policy. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on the RSPCA as being kind of responsible and involved in the prosecution process. Do you think that's an adequate or a justifiable use of donations, or should we be using that money to rescue the animals?
I think it's a difficult one, because I know there were a couple of years ago there was talks of perhaps the UK government, it being law cases regarding animals actually being taken on by by a body other than the RSPCA, and they were saying that the cases would essentially be even less, because if the RSPCA won't do it, there's who else is going to, really. There's even less sort of impetus for the CPS to take it on, the Crown Prosecution Service, really. It's difficult because obviously the resources are so stretched, and I feel kind of bad because I feel like I go in on them in the RSPCA a little bit on this, but they do some amazing work with the amount that they have. But at the same time, I feel like, as I say, if they don't do it, who will? Which is another reason why in my actual thesis I'm trying to fight for animals being recognised as persons, and that would remove a huge burden in terms of, because it would be dealt with in a completely different mechanism. It would take the RSPCA out of it, theoretically. That's what I'm working with at the moment. But yeah, I do, in an ideal world, yeah, somebody other than the RSPCA would take it on. But at the moment, as I said a couple of years ago, I remember them saying nobody else will do it. Who can do it but us? So yeah.
And there's a question here, Corrina, as well about using punishment. So how effective might punishment be when we're aware that the problem is mental illness? Because you pulled out kind of some of the causes of hoarding. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's another one, because obviously all the research that I've done on this is all US centric, because it's really not looked at in this country at all. And a lot of the studies were saying, that criminalization really isn't, on its own, certainly is completely ineffective, because once they've either, paid the fine, served the sentence, whatever, they'll just go out and buy more, and there's no sort of regulation. So it really is a really difficult one to solve, because I think there should be mental health interventions. Definitely there needs to be some sort of addressing of the root cause, but again, it comes back to lack of money, lack of resources for anyone who's tackling, whether it's the RSPCA or the UK's mental health services, which are getting slashed all the time. Yeah, so that's kind of with strict liability. That's one of the reasons why I sort of looked at that as a solution, because it's like I said, comparable to a kind of speeding fine, where you've committed a crime. Doesn't matter why you did it, doesn't matter the circumstances in which you did it. You've committed a crime, and here's a fine, or here's the I won't say punishment, but here's how we kind of resolve this. But obviously there are issues with every single thing every solution I've tried to propose. None of them are perfect. But yeah.
Thanks so much. Okay, so we're just about out of time. Are there any final questions or any final points for any of the speakers this afternoon?